you can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, play the news from The Australian.
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Wednesday, June 12. A giant stink has broken out between two powerful Australian institutions, the AFL and the CFMEU. The construction union's boss, John Setka, has told The Australian he's furious the Australian Football League has hired a former building watchdog as its new head of umpiring. Setka says the union will make misery for the footy code on its worksites. Queensland's Labor government is throwing the kitchen sink at winning the next election, plunging the state into debt and deficit to bankroll an $11.2 billion cost of living package in its new budget. That story's live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Police are preparing for potential clashes between pro- and anti-Chinese protesters when Premier Li Qiang visits Australia in coming days. Anthony Albanese is hailing the trip as a restoration of Australia's bond with China and flagging some big news about two very special Chinese Australians.
I think we should get a panda bear.
You say that now, but I'm the one who's going to end up feeding him and walking him.
This is an episode of the turn-of-the-century TV drama The West Wing. A political consultant named Mandy Hampton is discussing a matter of great political importance with the White House's Deputy Chief of Staff, Josh Lyman.
You guys have gotten something more than 3,000 letters in the last 10 days wanting to know when we're getting the new bear for the National Zoo.
What happened to the old bear?
Lum Lum, she died 2 weeks ago.
Pandas are a big deal in international affairs. It's called panda diplomacy, and it's actually a pretty good way of gauging the temperature of China's geopolitical relationships. All the giant pandas on the planet technically belong to China. There are about 2,500 living in the wild and in captivity. China loans them out to zoos and conservation organisations. Australia has two pandas on loan from China since 2009. They're called Wang Wang and Fu Ni, and they live at Adelaide Zoo. For a while there, as Australia's relationship with China turned seriously toxic, Wang Wang and Fu Ni looked likely to be hauled out at any moment. But Chinese Premier Li Qiang is coming to Australia this weekend, and his first stop is Adelaide. That's making China watchers think things are looking up. Ben Packham is the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent.
Look, China is very particular about its pandas. You don't get given pandas, they're always lent, and they're a symbol of the strength of the bilateral relationship. I recall that Wang Wang and Fu Ni were due to be returned to China, but their stay in Adelaide was extended after that visit by Anthony Albanese to Beijing last November.
The relationship has gone through some extremely tough times over the past few years, Ben. Do you think there were ever considerations about taking the pandas back?
Oh, look, I think that appeared to be the threat. They've been given a reprieve. There's been some panda diplomacy in the US recently as well. Like the koala, perhaps even more so than the koala, the pandas are a symbol of China and they're sort of greatly loved by the Chinese people. And to have them lent out to another country is certainly in the Chinese eyes a great honour for Australia.
Li Qiang is the second most powerful figure in China after President Xi Jinping, who hasn't been here for a decade. Li's visit is highly significant as China winds back savage trade sanctions it imposed after taking umbrage at Scott Morrison's suggestions China was responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Look, this is all part of the stabilisation of the bilateral relationship since the Labor Party came back into office here. The next step may or may not be a visit from Xi Jinping. That one would be a much more sort of difficult prospect in terms of the sort of optics of such a visit. Public opinion has hardened substantially against China since the president was last in the country some 10 years ago when he addressed the Australian Parliament. So, you have all the irritants and long-standing problems in the relationship, including foreign interference, espionage, hacking, trade bans, human rights questions. There's so many issues on which Australia and China disagree these days, and also including AUKUS. It's really only designed with one adversary in mind, and that's China. The world has moved on a lot since Xi Jinping was last in Australia, so I wouldn't be expecting a visit by the president necessarily to follow this one, but certainly this visit does continue that process of sort of improvement in ties that Labor has been very keen to do, and with the support of the opposition. I mean, the opposition does agree that it's a good thing that we are able to speak to our Chinese counterparts, but it still does have a much harder line on many of those key strategic issues.
Adelaide's important for more than just adorable reasons. It's where the Australian Defence Force will build a fleet of nuclear submarines designed to supercharge our future defence efforts. And as front listeners know, China is seriously unimpressed by the AUKUS submarine project and is making big military moves in international waters around Australia. Here's South Australian Premier Peter Malinauskas talking about the subs, which are a long-range stealth weapon designed to limit the threat from, China.
The nuclear submarine is the ultimate apex predator. The moment a nuclear submarine enters the water, it immediately and fundamentally tilts the balance of power.
The last visit by a senior Chinese leader was when Foreign Minister Wang Yi came here in March. That visit was notable for the inclusion of former Prime Minister Paul Keating, who held a meeting with Wang Yi, who of course is united with Mr Keating on not being a fan of the AUKUS Defence Pact. Do you think anything of that note will happen this time, or is this going to be much more sober and formal?
Well, I think the government will be hoping that there's no sort of wildcard sideline events planned by the Chinese, but you never can be too sure, I think. It was quite embarrassing to the government, the Paul Keating meeting. That really did sort of highlight some of China's criticisms of Australia's stance using the very symbolic and powerful symbolism of Paul Keating to sort of amplify those complaints that they have about Australia's treatment of China.
Your job, as I said, is Foreign Affairs and Defence Correspondent, Ben. So that's the very delicate side of negotiations with another country like China, things like pandas. And it's also the very pointy part of it too. And in the defence area, Australia's had some quite serious moments with China of late. Can you tell us a little bit about those, what happened, and what do they tell us about where the relationship's at?
China is quite aggressive in the South China Sea and other territorial waters close to China. So there's been a couple of recent incidents. The most recent one was in early May, in which Chinese fighter jet dropped flares in front of an Australian helicopter that was policing sanctions against North Korea in the Yellow Sea. That was quite a dangerous encounter, and the Australian helicopter was forced to sort of take evasive action. The other incident that many people will remember was the one in which a Chinese warship used its sonar while some Australian divers were freeing a fishing net from HMAS Toowoomba. That was last year in the South China Sea, and those divers were sort of quite lucky to not be seriously injured because the sonar is quite powerful and it can cause serious sort of ruptures of eardrums and so forth. So the Australian Defence Force and the government made, firm sort of protests in both of those cases with their Chinese counterparts. But this is really a part of a pattern of Chinese behaviour that we see not just with Australia. It happens a lot with nations, including the Philippines, who really do have a pretty rough time in the South China Sea when they try and replenish supplies for some of their personnel stationed on some of these disputed features. And Tokyo regularly protests about Chinese ships and aircraft being in its territory, and certainly America also has issues as well.
Coming up, a strange scene in Parliament ahead of the Chinese Premier's visit. Subscribers to The Australian get all the big news first, and it's a lot cheaper than a day's supply of bamboo for Wang Wang and Funi. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au. And we'll be back after this break. A strange scene unfolded in Federal Parliament House on Tuesday. A group of 30 Chinese officials descended on the building, visiting the Cabinet Office, the Ministerial Wing, and other places normally only open to the most senior Australian staff.
One of my colleagues got a call this morning from someone who told her about the group that was moving through the place. So she quickly told me, and I went down there, and, I was just sort of standing around listening. They can't really kick you out if you're in one of those public areas.
It's one of the things that makes China so very different from Australia. Here, the government is not really able to control the message quite as much as they would like.
Yes, no, we are often writing things and doing things that the government would prefer not to have discussed. So that certainly doesn't happen in China.
It was kind of weird because up until that point, Anthony Albanese had refused to reveal Li Qiang was definitely coming, or when he'd be here, even though New Zealand had already announced he'll be over there earlier in the week.
Anthony Albanese has played it very much by the book on these types of diplomatic meetings. Ever since he was elected, Labor made a big point in opposition about Scott Morrison's leaking of those text messages with Emmanuel Macron around the cancellation of the attack class submarine. And so Labor has been, really insistent about these kind of matters of protocol. But it sort of gets a little bit silly when everyone knows the Chinese Premier's coming, but the Prime Minister sort of can't quite bring himself to say it and calls it a potential visit. It's just not a particularly sort of deft way of taking those questions.
Ben Packham is the Australian's Foreign Affairs and Defence correspondent. 2024 is the year of the AUKUS elections. Our allies, the UK and US, go to the polls in coming months. And then Australia too will vote in federal elections late this year or early next. Live right now on theaustralian.com.au is a debate between some of the smartest analysts in foreign affairs, The Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan, and editors from the Wall Street Journal and the Times of London. Check it out and don't forget to join our subscribers at theaustralian.com.au.